The men who ran the worst medical experiments in human history died old, rich, and free. Not one day in prison. They weren't hanged, they weren't tried, most of them weren't even named in public for decades. Several of them went on to have careers, respectable ones. One helped found a major pharmaceutical company. Some of them taught in universities, treated patients, signed their names on medical papers, and died old men in comfortable beds surrounded by family. And the reason they walked, the reason none of them ever answered for what they did, isn't Japan. It's the United States. That's the part I couldn't let go of, and it's why we're here. Because before any of that, before the cover-up, there was a place in occupied China where doctors did things to living people that I'm still not sure I have the words for. Men, women, children. Infected on purpose, cut open while awake, frozen, starved, used. And the people doing it weren't monsters crawling out of some nightmare. They were doctors, professors, the most educated people their country produced. That's the question I want you sitting with the whole way through. Not how could monsters do this, but how could ordinary, brilliant, respectable people do this, and then be allowed to just walk back into normal life like it never happened? This is the story of Unit 731, and by the end, I don't think you'll be angriest at the men who did it. I think you'll be angriest at the ones who let them go. To understand how a country ends up with a place like this, you have to understand what Japan was 100 years ago, because it was nothing like the Japan you know now. Forget the Japan of bullet trains and quiet politeness. The Japan of the 1930s was a nation that had worked itself into a kind of fever, an absolute worship of the emperor, a belief that the Japanese were a divine people, and underneath all of it, a hunger to rule. They even had a phrase for it. Hakko Ichiu, the whole world under one roof. And I want you to hear how that actually sounds when you unpack it, because it's not a slogan about togetherness. It meant the Japanese believed they had a God-given right to rule every other people on Earth. That's the mindset the military rode straight into power. But here's the problem, and it's the problem at the root of this entire story. An empire needs fuel. Oil, coal, iron, rubber, the raw materials that build armies and keep them moving. And Japan, for all its ambition, had almost none of its own. It's a chain of islands with thin resources and enormous appetite. So the country made a decision that every hungry empire eventually makes. If we don't have it, we'll take it from someone who does. In 1931, the Japanese army marched into Manchuria, a huge resource-rich region in the north of China, and simply took it, set up a puppet state, and called it their own. But that was never going to be enough. Japan looked at the map and it saw all of Asia, all of the Pacific, as something it was destined to hold. And it looked at the three powers standing in the way, the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. And it saw a problem it couldn't solve with soldiers alone. Because all three of those enemies had something Japan didn't. People. Huge populations, which meant huge armies. Japan could not win a war of bodies against nations that simply had more bodies to throw. So somewhere in the minds of Japan's military leaders, a cold and logical idea took shape. If we can't outnumber them, and we can't outproduce them, then we need a weapon that doesn't care how many of them there are. A weapon that spreads on its own. A weapon that turns their greatest strength, all those millions of people packed into cities, into their greatest weakness. And that idea, that specific, patient, monstrous idea, is where this story really begins. Every horror needs an architect, and this one had a name, Shiro Ishii. And if you were picturing some cold, calculating mastermind, the kind of villain who moves through a room and everyone goes quiet, you'd be wrong. By most accounts, Ishii was strange. He studied medicine and biology at the Imperial University of Kyoto, and he was clearly brilliant. Nobody disputes that. But the other students kept their distance from him. He was arrogant, loud, the kind of man who was certain he was the smartest person in any room and made sure you knew it. And there's this one detail about him that I can't stop thinking about, because it tells you everything. As a student, Ishii grew cultures of bacteria in his own home, and he didn't treat them like a science project. He treated them like pets. He cared for them. He was fond of them. Sit with that for a second. A young man alone with jars of the very things that kill people, feeling something like affection for them. That's who's about to be handed thousands of human lives. In the early 1920s, Ishii joined the army as a military surgeon, and here his arrogance actually served him because he climbed fast. He was ambitious, he was tireless, and he knew how to make powerful men listen. Then, in 1928, the army sent him on a 2-year tour of the Western world. Officially, it was an exchange program, a young scientist broadening his horizons. In reality, Ishii was shopping. He traveled through Europe and North America with his eyes open, and he noticed something that would change everything. He noticed that the West was terrified of disease, and they had every reason to be. Not long before, the Spanish flu had torn through the world and killed something like 50 million people. Europe had spent centuries being hollowed out by plague, smallpox, measles, syphilis. Disease had killed more Europeans than every war combined. And Ishii, watching all of this, did the math that no decent person would ever do. He saw all that fear, all that death, and instead of horror, he saw opportunity. He saw a weapon nobody was using yet. There's one more piece he picked up on that trip, and it's almost funny in how backwards it is. In 1925, most of the world's nations, Japan included, had signed something called the Geneva Protocol, an agreement banning the use of biological and chemical weapons in war. A line drawn by humanity: we will not do this to each other. And Ishii looked at that ban and drew exactly the wrong lesson from it. He reasoned if the whole world went to the trouble of banning this, it must work. It must be devastating. Otherwise, why bother forbidding it? So he came home to Japan carrying an idea that most people would have been horrified to even voice out loud, and he started looking for powerful men who wouldn't be horrified at all. As it turned out, they weren't hard to find. Ishii found his audience, and they were exactly the men you'd fear would listen. Powerful figures in the Japanese military, generals, and the chief surgeon of the army himself, men who were already dreaming about how Japan could punch above its weight. And Ishii walked in with a pitch that must have sounded like a miracle to them. He told them, forget steel, forget gunpowder, forget trying to outbuild enemies who will always have more factories and more men than you. Those weapons are expensive, and they're a game Japan is going to lose. But biological weapons? Disease? That's cheap. You grow it, it costs almost nothing, and once you release it, it does the killing for you, and it keeps killing after you've gone home. And then Ishii added the line that sealed it, the promise that made him indispensable. He told them he could build it, not theorize about it. Build it. All he needed were 2 things. The first was money, reliable funding, the kind only a government can provide. And the second is where the floor drops out of this story. He told them that to make the weapon actually work, to get results he could trust, he would need to test it on human beings, living ones. Because animals only tell you so much, and Ishii wanted certainty. Now stop and think about what that meeting actually was. A room full of educated, powerful men, and one doctor calmly explaining that he intended to experiment on living people. And not one of them stood up and walked out. Not one of them said no. They loved it. The idea of a cheap superweapon was too good to refuse. So they took it all the way to the top, to Emperor Hirohito himself, the God Emperor, the divine figure at the center of everything Japan believed about itself. They brought him a plan for a weapon that would make Japan great and unstoppable, and Hirohito gave his approval. I want to be careful and honest here because historians still argue about exactly how much Hirohito knew about the specific horrors that would follow. But the program got its blessing from the highest possible place, and the money started to flow. In 1932, it came into existence under a quiet, forgettable name, Project Togo. Ishii had his funding, he had his permission, he had the backing of an empire. Everything he'd been reaching for since he was that strange student alone with his jars of bacteria was suddenly, terribly real. All he needed now was a place to do it, somewhere far from Japanese eyes, somewhere the screaming wouldn't reach anyone who mattered. And he found exactly the place. The place Ishii chose tells you he understood exactly what he was about to do, because everything about the location was designed around one assumption, that this had to be hidden. He set up his first laboratory inside an old fortress near the city of Harbin, deep in occupied Manchuria, not in Japan. And that choice was deliberate on two levels, both of them chilling. The first reason was almost practical in the coldest possible way. If something went wrong, if one of these engineered diseases ever got loose, it would burn through the local Chinese population, not Japanese civilians. The victims were, to Ishii, disposable by design, and their location was part of the design. But the second reason is the one that really tells you who these men were. Manchuria was occupied territory. It was full of people the Japanese army had already decided didn't count, and that meant an endless, renewable supply of human beings that nobody powerful would come looking for. Here's where the language they used matters, because it's a window into how they made themselves able to do this. The prisoners brought to the lab were not called prisoners. They were called maruta. It's a Japanese word, and it means logs. Logs, as in timber, as in lumber, as in a thing you cut and burn. There's a grim story that the word started as a joke, a cover. The facility was officially disguised as a lumber mill, so the staff joked about how many logs they had. And the joke stuck, and it became the actual term. And I need you to understand what that word did, because it's the same trick every atrocity in history has relied on. If you call a person a log, you don't have to think of him as a person. You've already done the hardest part of the cruelty before you've laid a hand on him. You've deleted him. So who were the logs? They were brought in by the Kempei Tai, Japan's military police, and if you want a comparison, think of them as Japan's version of the Gestapo. They swept people up across Manchuria and the countries around it. Criminals, yes, and bandits, that's how it was justified, but also the homeless, political prisoners, Chinese resistance fighters who dared to oppose the occupation, and ordinary people who'd simply been in the wrong place. Most of the victims were Chinese, but there were Koreans, Russians, Mongolians, anyone the machine could reach. Gender didn't matter. Age didn't matter. There were men, there were women, and I have to say this plainly because looking away from it is its own kind of lie. There were children. And now here's the detail that I think is the most quietly horrifying part of the whole beginning. When the prisoners first arrived, they were treated well. They were fed properly, rice, meat, fish, sometimes even given alcohol. They were kept warm, kept comfortable, allowed to recover their strength. And if you're wondering why a place like this would show any kindness at all, the answer is the worst answer possible. They weren't being cared for. They were being prepared. Ishii needed his subjects healthy because a healthy body gives cleaner data. They were fattening people up the way you'd tend to livestock before slaughter, not out of mercy, but because a strong, well-fed body would show the disease more clearly once they infected it. The kindness was part of the experiment. And once a person was healthy enough, the real work began. I've been building up to this section, and now that I'm here, I'll be honest with you about how I'm going to handle it, because I think you deserve to know. I'm not going to walk you through these experiments like a manual. I'm not going to give you the step-by-step, because some of what happened in that place does not need to be described in detail to be understood, and describing it in detail starts to feel less like telling history and more like performing it. So I'm going to tell you what was done and who it was done to, and I'm going to trust you to feel the weight of it. That's the deal. The core of the program was disease. That was the whole point. Ishii was building a biological weapon, and to build it, he needed to know exactly what these diseases did to a human being, from the inside, in real time. So the prisoners, the ones who'd been fed and rested and made healthy, were deliberately infected. Plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, diseases chosen because they killed efficiently and spread on their own. And then the staff, the doctors, the technicians, watched. They recorded everything, how fast it moved, what it did to the body, how long a person lasted. Human beings were reduced to data points in a notebook, their suffering measured to the minute. And when they wanted to see what the disease had done to the organs inside, they did not always wait for the person to die first. I'm going to leave that sentence there because you understood it, and I'm not going to make either of us live inside it any longer than that. There were other experiments, and they sprawled outward from disease into something like a catalog of every way a human body can be pushed to its limit. There were the frostbite experiments, where prisoners were taken out into the brutal Manchurian winter and their limbs were frozen solid, so the staff could study what cold does to flesh. There were experiments with pressure, with starvation, with thirst. Remember that fact about the body being mostly water, the one I refused to open this video with? This is where it comes from. It comes from someone in that place actually doing it to a living person and writing down the result. There were weapons tested on tied-down prisoners. There were mothers, and there were children, and I'm not going to say more about that than that it happened, because it did, and because the historians who've spent their lives on this insist that we not pretend it didn't. And through all of it, I keep coming back to the thing I told you at the start. The people doing this weren't howling monsters. They took breaks. They ate lunch. They filled out paperwork. They wrote precise, clinical, professional notes in neat handwriting. And then they went home. One of the things survivors and later investigators described is how ordinary the atmosphere was, how routine. That's the horror I actually can't shake. Not that human beings are capable of cruelty. We've always known that. It's that human beings are capable of turning cruelty into a job, into a 9-to-5, into something you clock in and out of. That's the thing I need you to carry with you, because in a little while we're going to talk about what happened to these men afterward, and you're going to need to remember that they were never out of their minds. They knew exactly what they were doing. They just decided it was worth it. And here's the part most people don't realize. This was never only about the lab. Everything they learned inside those walls was meant to go out into the world, onto real cities, onto people who had no idea any of this existed. Because a weapon isn't a weapon until you use it, and Japan was about to use it. Here's the thing about a weapon. The men who build it are never satisfied with just knowing it works in a lab. They want to see it work in the world. And Ishii's program had grown into something enormous by now. It had a real name, the one history would remember it by. Unit 731. A sprawling complex with its own airfields, its own prison blocks, its own factories breeding disease by the ton. They were producing plague, anthrax, and cholera not by the test tube, but at industrial scale. And a weapon produced at that scale is built to be used on a scale to match. So they used it, on real Chinese cities, on people going about their ordinary lives who had never heard of Unit 731 and never would. The method was as monstrous as everything else about this program and grimly clever, which somehow makes it worse. You can't exactly drop a jar of plague from a plane and expect it to work. The fall would kill the bacteria. So Ishii's people found a living delivery system that nature had already perfected. Fleas. Plague-carrying fleas, bred by the millions inside the unit. They raised vast quantities of fleas, let them feed on infected rats until they were carrying the disease, and then they packed them into special ceramic bombs. Ceramic because it was fragile enough to shatter gently and release the fleas alive rather than incinerate them. And then they flew over Chinese cities and let them fall. Fleas rained down on towns like Ningbo and Chandai. They didn't explode, they didn't burn, they just quietly seeded the plague into a civilian population and let it spread on its own, exactly the way Ishii had promised his generals years before. People started dying of a medieval disease in the middle of the 20th century with no idea why. Whole families, whole streets. And the men who caused it were hundreds of miles away, reviewing the results like a farmer checking a harvest. There's a moment in all this that I think is the universe's idea of grim justice, and it's worth sitting with. This weapon they'd built, this disease that doesn't care who it kills, it didn't care that its makers were Japanese either. At one point, some of the wells used by Japanese troops were contaminated during these operations, and the blowback killed thousands of their own soldiers. Estimates run to around 10,000 Japanese casualties from their own biological weapons. That's the thing about a weapon designed to spread on its own. It doesn't read uniforms. It doesn't stop at the border you drew for it. They'd built something they couldn't fully control, and it turned on them, and even that, even watching their own men die of the plague they'd manufactured, wasn't enough to make them stop. Because by now, the war was turning, and when a desperate empire starts to lose, the things it's willing to do only get worse. For years, Unit 731 operated on one unspoken assumption, that Japan was going to win, that the whole thing would eventually be justified by victory, that the weapon would be worth it, and that no one would have to answer for any of it, because winners don't stand trial. And then, over the course of 1945, that assumption fell apart completely. The war turned against Japan on every front, and in August of 1945, 2 atomic bombs erased Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union came pouring into Manchuria, and it was over. Japan was going to surrender. And in that moment, the men of Unit 731 stopped being scientists building a superweapon and became something much smaller and much more familiar, men desperate not to get caught. Because they understood something with perfect clarity. If the world found out what had happened in Harbin, they would hang. So they moved fast, and they moved with the same cold efficiency they'd brought to everything else. The order came down to destroy it all. And here is where the horror reaches its final, sickening note. Because their idea of destroying the evidence included destroying the witnesses. The remaining prisoners, the human beings still held in those cells, were murdered. All of them. Killed so they could never speak, never testify, never point a finger. The people who had already suffered more than we can comprehend were denied even the small mercy of being the ones who survived to tell it. Then they went to work on the buildings. They dynamited the complex, tried to blow the whole facility into rubble so nothing recognizable would remain. They burned documents, though, and this matters, they did not burn the most important ones. They were careful about that. They destroyed the evidence of the crime, but they preserved the data, the findings, the research. The precise, meticulous notes recording exactly what disease does to a living human body, information that existed nowhere else on Earth because no one else on Earth had been monstrous enough to gather it. They kept that. They packed it up and carried it home to Japan. Because even now, even in the collapse, they understood that those notebooks were the most valuable thing they owned. Those notebooks were their insurance policy. And Shiro Ishii, the architect, the man who grew bacteria like pets, the man whose name was on all of it, Ishii went home, and he did something almost comical in its arrogance. He faked his own death. He had a fake funeral staged, complete with a public announcement, to convince the world that the war criminal Shiro Ishii was gone, and there was no one left to pursue. And then he settled quietly into a house in Japan and waited to see whether anyone was coming for him. Someone was. The Americans were coming, but not for the reason you'd hope. This is the part I told you about at the very beginning. This is the part I couldn't let go of. So take a breath, because here it is. When the war ended, the United States occupied Japan, and American investigators started pulling on threads. And it didn't take them long to realize what Unit 731 had actually been. They understood fairly quickly that they had stumbled onto the largest biological weapons program in the history of the world, and that the men who ran it were alive and reachable, and sitting on a mountain of human experimentation data that no other country on Earth possessed. And that's where a decision got made that I still, after everything, find hard to say out loud. The United States chose the data over justice. Instead of arresting these men and putting them on trial for crimes that would have hanged them 10 times over, American officials cut them a deal. They offered Ishii and his top scientists immunity from prosecution, a guarantee that they would never be charged, never be tried, never answer for a single thing they had done, in exchange for handing over their research. That's it. That's the trade. Everything they knew about biological weapons, all those notebooks written in the blood of thousands of people, in return for their freedom. And they took it. Of course they took it. And the United States government made it happen and then buried it. Now, I want to be fair, because being fair is the only thing that makes the anger mean anything. The American logic wasn't cartoon villainy. It was the Cold War, just barely beginning. The reasoning went like this. This data exists whether we like it or not. Those people are already dead. Nothing we do brings them back. And if we don't grab this research, the Soviet Union will. Better it sits in American hands than Soviet ones. That was the calculation. And I understand the calculation. I even understand how a person makes it. But understanding it is not the same as forgiving it, because look at what the calculation actually purchased. It purchased the freedom of men who froze children to death. It told the victims and the families of the victims that their suffering was evidence in a ledger, and the ledger had been settled, and the men who did it got to keep their lives, their careers, their reputations, and their comfortable old age. The Soviets, for what it's worth, did put some Unit 731 members they'd captured on trial. But that trial was dismissed in the West as communist propaganda, which was convenient, because taking it seriously would have meant admitting what everyone on the American side already knew. And so the men walked. Ishii lived out his years quietly in Japan and died of throat cancer in 1959, an old man in his own bed. Others did far better than quietly. Some went on to senior positions in Japanese medicine and pharmaceuticals and public health, the very fields they had desecrated. One of the men connected to this program helped lead a major Japanese blood and pharmaceutical company. They became respected. They became establishment. They taught the next generation, and almost none of them ever said they were sorry, because they never had to. That's the ending. Not a courtroom, not a reckoning. A handshake, a filing cabinet, and silence. And that silence held for decades. Most of the world never heard about any of this, not because it was too small to notice, but because two governments, the one that did it and the one that bought it, both had every reason to make sure you never found out.
So let me come back to the question I asked you at the very start, the one I told you to carry the whole way through. Not how could monsters do this, but how could ordinary people do this? Because that's the part that should actually frighten us, and I think it's the reason this story matters far beyond the horror of it. The men of Unit 731 were not born different from you or me. They were educated. They were respected. They had families they loved and mentors they admired and colleagues they had lunch with. And somewhere along the way, one small permission at a time, they talked themselves into a place where a living person could become a log, and a child could become a data point, and cruelty could become a job you clock out of at the end of the day. Nobody in that facility woke up one morning and decided to become a monster. They arrived at it gradually with the full cooperation of their own conscience, each step reasonable in the light of the last. That's the warning buried in this story, and it's why I don't think we get to file it away as something foreign, or something that belongs only to one country in one dark decade. The capacity that built Unit 731 isn't Japanese, it's human. It lives wherever people are taught that some other group of people doesn't fully count, and history keeps teaching that lesson over and over in every language. So the reason to remember the people who died in Harbin isn't only to honor them, though we should. It's to stay honest about what we're all capable of when we stop seeing the person in front of us. That's the whole point. That's why I made this. Now, I want to hear from you, and I mean that. Of everything in this story, what stays with you the most? Is it the experiments themselves? Is it the logs, the way a single word made all of it possible? Or is it the ending, the fact that the country that calls itself the good guys handed these men their freedom and then buried the receipt? Tell me down in the comments, because I read them, and I think this is a conversation worth having. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the real stories, the ones your education skipped, told properly and told honestly, then subscribe and stick around, because there is so much more of it and almost none of it is being taught. I'll see you in the next one.